and not wait until you bring the chocolate bar home. A second example of this category relates to when our impulses are actually really wrong, or our inclination of what to do is just exactly the wrong thing to do for our own benefit. And so a good example of this relates to depression. So they found that people with depression, if you ask them how much they're going to enjoy an activity, they'll actually tend to underestimate it. So you say, how much would you enjoy seeing your friends? They'll say, it would be okay. But if you actually force them out of the house, they actually tend to have a better time than they thought. So this leads to behavior in depressed people where they sit around their apartment. And guess what? It makes them feel more depressed. And so an example of this sort of behavior in my own life relates to feeling tired. I've observed that when I feel tired, the thing I most want to do is lie down. And that makes me more tired. So if I have to actually do anything, then that's exactly the worst behavior I can do. But it's exactly the behavior I most am inclined to do. Whereas exercising actually makes me feel less tired. And that's exactly what I don't want to do when I'm feeling tired, is go do jumping jacks. But what I found is that if I come up with a list of things to do in response to feeling tired in advance, I can actually get myself to do those things. So I have a list that basically it says, when you're tired, do the following things. And drink some tea, put on energetic music, do some jumping jacks. And I now have gotten in the habit of just consulting, either physically or mentally, my list of, I'm feeling tired. What do I do when I'm tired? I do these things. I don't listen to what I feel inclined to do. I listen to what I remember that I'm supposed to do. And so that's just another way of tricking my brain into doing the smart thing again. And so, let's see here. I guess this leads me to, it leads me, to my there we go. My next example, and this relates to dating, and I think this is actually a common thing that a lot of people deal with, which is that they form strong attachments, but not always to the right people. So sometimes how strongly we feel about someone may not be that related to how fundamentally compatible we are with them, or how likely they are really to make us happy in the long term. But once you form an attachment, it can be really hard to break it off. It can be painful, you might delay it, and so forth. And so for someone like this, they might try to pre-commit to a strategy that says, if you've gone on 4 dates with someone and you don't see fundamental compatibility, maybe you should just break it off right then. Because if you wait until 8 dates, you might not be able to break it off, or it might be very painful to break it off. If you're lucky, you'll break it off and it'll be painful. If you're unlucky, you'll end up being with that person for 3 months or 3 years, when you could have actually been with someone you would have been much happier with if you just hadn't formed that attachment in the first place. So basically, in conclusion, I just wanted to point out that I think there are lots of ways that we tend to behave irrationally that actually collectively cause us a lot of harm. We may not classically consider these things in the space of what we consider rational or irrational, but I think that if we view rationality more generally as behaving in ways that optimize our goals, whether our goals are happiness or whatever they are, then yeah, there are lots of ways that rationality can really benefit us. And a lot of these relate to basically devoting your cognitive resources to trying to solve problems, understanding your limitations, and then working to solve them. Thank you.
I'm only asking this question because I've already asked you before, so maybe you had some time to think about it.
Give me a softball.
Yeah, it's a hard question, but I found that, if you imagine irrationality as a curve that approaches this asymptote, and, it's kind of like a limit. It doesn't really reach perfection. So how much time should we actually spend trying to maximize, our kind of critical thinking, as opposed to maybe going out and trying things to see what the types of things we actually like. And there's many types of achieving well-being, we're not constantly making decisions. There's other things we do. So
right.
What is, when do we stop? All right. Then when do we say, all right, we've learned enough, and it's time to actually do other things,
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tough question, in part because I think it depends a lot on the person and also the type of problem you're dealing with. I mean, some problems, just a little bit of thinking can get you really far, and so you might get a lot of bang for your buck in that sense. And other problems, they're really hard to change. So for example, some psychological irrationalities, like really severe OCD, where you maybe flush the toilet 20 times in a row, can be really hard to change on your own, and you might actually need to go so far as to seek, professional help. Maybe you go through an exposure therapy program. So I guess I would say that I think it's worth, when we have a problem or issue in our life, whether it's coming to false conclusions or mispredicting things or doing some behavior that makes us unhappy, it's worth experimenting with the various rationality techniques. Maybe find out from other people who are interested in rationality what techniques they've used to try and solve this. Try them. If they don't work for you, then they don't work for you, and maybe they're not always going to work. But I think it's worth experimenting with, at least, if that makes sense. Yeah, Henry?
So, firstly, thank you very much for the talk. So just to start off with, as a working definition for instrumental rationality, would you be happy with the definition, rational behaviour is behaviour that aims to maximise utility?
I wouldn't say utility. I think that's a little restrictive, because a lot of goals that people have are not actually utility maximizing. Mm-hmm. Like, a lot of people value being remembered after they're dead, and unless you think that you're going to be watching from somewhere what happens after you're dead, well, that has nothing to do with utility. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I think many of those people don't think that they're going to be watching from somewhere. They just value that state of the world. So I would say, more generally, it's really about maximizing your goals, whatever those are. Happiness is obviously a major goal for a lot of people, but it's not the only one.
So maximising fulfilment of goals is instrumental. A behaviour is rational insofar as it is the optimal behaviour for goal fulfilment.
Right, and instrumental rationality maybe is the study of how do you achieve that. Yeah.
So I think one useful distinction at this point is between subjective instrumental rationality and objective instrumental rationality, or a behaviour which is subjectively rational in this sense and objectively rational. What seems to you to be the best way to achieve your goals, and what is actually the best way to achieve your goals. So I take it you said you've become more rational, more instrumentally rational. I take it, in some sense, you've always been trying to achieve your goals, right? Everyone, that's what we do, we try and achieve our goals. So I suppose you're saying you've become more objectively rational.
Well, what I've become is I've become better at achieving my goals, but not just in an ad hoc way, but by learning more about rationality, I should say. Viewing things through the lens of, is this rational, why or why not? Learning to recognize patterns of irrationality, learning to think about things that need thinking about because I have some behavior that's clearly irrational, and that sort of thing.
So there are a few points in relation to that I think are quite interesting. So if we just talk about objective, a behaviour is objectively rational insofar as it actually does or doesn't advance your goals.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to me obvious that we could conclude that animals aren't rational. Insofar as they act in ways that are very carefully fine-tuned by evolution to advance their goals or not advance their goals.
That's a good point. When I was talking about animals not being rational, I really meant epistemically rational. They're not consciously estimating probabilities. Their genes may be very implicitly estimating probabilities.
Mm-hmm. There's another interesting distinction on just looking at subjective rationality here. It's one that comes up in economics in terms of expressed and revealed preferences. So if you say to someone, do you want to stop smoking? Say, oh God, yeah, I want to stop smoking desperately. And yet, every time they go out, they say, oh, well, sorry, I'll have a cigarette.
Mm-hmm. Where you get this?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I think there are two views you could take on that. You could say, well, clearly they were lying when they said they really wanted to stop smoking, because their behaviour shows that they didn't actually want to stop smoking. They are clearly attached to the idea of saying, they like to think that they want to stop smoking, but actually, clearly, they don't want to stop smoking. Otherwise, they wouldn't go out buying cigarettes. So, I think there's a question. Okay, there are a couple of questions here. But there's a question as to whether anyone, if we were to just say that people's behaviour reveals their preferences, and that the person who says they want to stop smoking actually doesn't really want to stop smoking, then it looks like everyone's going to always be acting rationally.
Right. Well, I think what's happening is if you define whatever you do to be what you want to do, then of course we're all doing what we want to do. It's sort of just a semantic issue at that point. One thing to note related to that is that we're not the same person moment to moment. Yeah. So, when I'm sitting there in front of a piece of chocolate cake, I'm thinking, I value the consumption of that cake and the pleasure I get from it because I'm about to have it. Whereas me, 3 months from then, thinking back on it, that 3 month a later version of me is not going to get to taste that cake in a sense. So they're like, oh, why did you eat that cake? That made no sense. So I mean, and of course we're always drifting over time. So I mean, so I think that there is some issue there of like not quite being the same identity. But I feel like I didn't answer your question.
No, I think I mean that's a fantastic point.